everybody, welcome again. This is Honors Biology. Before we get into our discussion on viruses and bacteria, I wanted to talk a little bit about exponential growth. So bacterial populations, a single cell living organism that begins to undergo fission and divide, they are going to grow extremely rapidly, and let's assume that there's nothing that's going to check their growth. So let's assume they have unlimited resources. Well, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a virus, or whether it's let's go with lily pads on a neighboring pond, for example. This idea of exponential growth is kind of tough to grasp until you actually see a practical example. So let's take this idea of lily pads on the pond. Let's go a 30-day growth sort of pattern here. And let's start with one lily pad on day one. So one lily pad day one, then day two you're going to have two. Day three you're going from 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, and so on. Well, early on in this growth pattern, it's going to be a very slow rate of increase. In fact, if you're walking by that pond every day, you're going to notice the lily pads, and they're going to appear kind of pretty. In fact, you may not notice in those early stages that there's any sort of real growth going on in terms of numbers. So I sped this along a little bit, and I wrote down the graph here. So this is exponential growth. And here's what I want you to appreciate from this hand-drawn graph here. Notice early on there's a relatively slow increase in the percent of pond with the lily pads present. So you're in this day 4, 5, or 6. It doesn't appear that there's much growth, and it certainly doesn't appear that there's going to be any sort of real problem here in the future. Again, it's slightly noticeable. But as we move farther out towards our 30-day timeline, let's say that we're at day 15. Again, it's not that noticeable, the increase, unless you're looking for it. So this is an important sort of concept here. Whether we're talking about the growth of populations, whether we're talking about the growth of bacteria, whether we're talking about the replication of viruses. Once a virus infects a cell, you will get exponential cellular infection in a way that's kind of similar. A lot more about that coming up here. Anyway, so here we go. We're still moving here, and these lily pads are increasing. They're doubling their population every day. So notice we're going to move all the way up to day 29. So day 29. Let's go right about here. So this is day 29. Even at day 29, notice here that at day 29, right here, notice that at day 29, half the pond is filled. The next day, we're up here where we have 100% of the pond filled. So again, this has far-reaching implications in terms of viral infection, in terms of bacterial infection, in terms of, let's talk about invasive species, species that enter new ecosystems from a different continent, let's say. You may be familiar with the famous invasive species in this area. These are the Asian carp. They were introduced from ponds and that sort of thing. I suppose when floods happened, these Asian carp got into the river. And these Asian carp don't really have any sort of real predators, and they in fact reproduced and have reproduced and are continually reproducing right now in this sort of exponential fashion here. So whether we're talking about ecosystems, whether we're talking about viral infection, whether we're talking about bacterial infection, we've got this idea of exponential growth. So here is a couple terms here, and I do want you to get this. Copy this down here. A couple important terms here. Notice these early stages here. This is going to be the lag phase. So here we are doubling our population, but relative to this later phase, we only have slight increases in growth. Notice this region here, this is the exponential phase. So I'll put exponential, just abbreviate, you write it out, exponential phase. So, pretty important. Now, if we do have, let's say this is a population, and a population of rabbits, let's say, usually we're going to have some sort of check on the population growth. So, or maybe a better example would be if you have bacteria that are growing exponentially in one of these petri dishes. You would see this sort of phase, we'd see a lag phase and we'd see an exponential phase, and the growth of the bacteria would begin to fill up that petri dish in a way that's similar to the growth of these lily pads filling up the pond. Now, once the bacteria completely populate those petri dishes, they will use up their resources, so they'll use up their food. They'll also begin to poison themselves. They're going to start producing metabolic waste products like lactic acid, and this is going to take the population and level the population off as we get a sort of equilibrium going on between the living creatures and the resources, but it won't be that long before these populations begin to subside because there's overcrowding, they're poisoning themselves essentially, and they've used up their resources. Well, so that was a good little introduction here, and we will be moving on to viruses and bacteria. That'll be in the next video. Thank you.